What if one chapter of the Bible is the hidden wiring behind every act of obedience, every instance of courage, every miracle you read about? What if Hebrews 11 is not merely a roll call of names, but a blueprint in plain sight, showing how ordinary people are drawn into God's extraordinary work? That is the claim we must wrestle with. Hebrews 11 shocks us because it reframes miracles not as magic, but as the fruit of a particular posture of faith. It will surprise you because it removes faith from the realm of positive thinking and places it squarely in the realm of costly trust, obedience, and often painful surrender. Hebrews 11 reads like a band of witnesses standing across centuries, each one a living footnote to the same thesis. The author gathers Abel and Enoch, Noah and Abraham, judges and kings, prophets and martyrs, and summarizes their lives under 4 words that change everything. By faith. Hebrews 11 repeatedly uses this phrase. The point is emphatic and somewhat unsettling. Faith in the biblical imagination is not primarily an inner emotion or a private optimism. It is a trust that moves feet, lifts hands, risks reputation, and often endures suffering. It is the posture by which God accomplishes his purposes without reducing him to a formula, or us to technicians of the divine. If this message is speaking to you, subscribe and save this video so you won't miss the rest of this deep dive. To begin, we need a quick exegetical frame. Hebrews 11:1 is the hinge. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Hebrews 11:1. The Greek word translated faith is pistis, used throughout the New Testament to describe a trust that is personal and relational. The author of Hebrews links pistis to hypostasis, a word rendered by some translations as assurance or substance, a firmness or reality that undergirds hope. Faith, then, is not mere wishful thinking. It is a confidence so concrete that it becomes the way people act toward promises they have not yet seen. The chapter then offers concrete case studies, lives lived because of that conviction. Notice the pattern. The author names each person and attaches the same verdict. By faith, this person did something, offered, walked, obeyed, crossed, surrendered. Each life is an argument. Faith does not eliminate risk. It reorients decisions toward God's promise. As we step into these lives, keep one rule in mind. Hebrews 11 is selective and theological. The author does not give a full biography. He selects moments that illuminate what faith looks like. When I say a story shows something, I mean the biblical author uses it to illustrate the pattern. Sometimes further historical or traditional details are interpretive and should be held lightly, noted as tradition rather than fact. Abel. Worship that pleases. Genesis 4, Hebrews 11:4. Abel is the first name on the chapter's list and the first example of what the Bible values, a heart that seeks God with integrity. Genesis 4 is concise but terrifying. Cain and Abel bring offerings. God accepts Abel's but not Cain's, and jealousy leads Cain to murder his brother. Hebrews 11:4 gives a theological reading of this episode. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain. We must be careful here. Hebrews does not tell us every motive or every detail in Genesis. Instead, the author draws our attention to Abel's act of offering and to its acceptability. What makes Abel's offering acceptable? The chapter points to the heart that trusts God and seeks his ways rather than mere external compliance. In the New Testament, the appeal to Abel is often read as a foreshadowing of Christ's atoning sacrifice, an innocent life given, and of a faith that looks forward to God's justice. See 1 John 3:12, Luke 11:50-51 for echoes. Abel models that worship is judged by the quality of our trust, not the magnitude of our ritual. Application vignette. Imagine a woman named Laura, who was raised in routine religious practice. She knows the prayers, attends the meetings, but her life is marked by quiet resentment. When she reads Abel's story, she sees a different posture, offering that springs from trust, not obligation. She begins to practice first-fruit gratitude, small acts of sacrifice that say, "Lord, I trust you more than my routine." The consequence is not a guaranteed miracle. It is a changed orientation of heart that will reframe decisions and relationships. Reflection prompt. Where is your worship ritual becoming a performance rather than a response? Journal one area where you can offer a small, concrete act of trust this week. Enoch, intimacy that leaves the world. Genesis 5:21-24, Hebrews 11-5. The next figure is startling in a different way. Enoch walks with God, and then he was no more because God took him. Genesis 5:24. Hebrews 11:5 compresses the shock into a theological point. Enoch pleased God and was taken before experiencing death in the ordinary way. This is a story that strains simple formulas. Tradition reads Enoch as a model of extraordinary intimacy, a life so aligned with God that death was circumvented. The author of Hebrews uses Enoch to teach that faith sometimes looks like permanence in relationship rather than permanence of presence. Enoch's walking with God is an image of daily, steady companionship, habits and attentions that produce an unseen but profound closeness. Application vignette. Consider Sam, a teacher worn down by cynicism in his profession. He begins to open small doors to God. 5 minutes of honest reflection before class, a brief moment to bring his burdens to God rather than bury them. Over months, his life shifts, not because Enoch's fate is replicated, but because steady companionship changes his priorities, shapes his courage, and colors his small choices. Exegetical aside, Hebrews 11's inclusion of Enoch is instructive. The author does not celebrate Enoch's escaping death as an end in itself. Rather, Enoch's life demonstrates faith as consistent relationship. In other words, faith is not only for crisis, it is cultivated in daily walking. Noah, obedience to warnings nobody else heard. Genesis 6-9, Hebrews 11:7. Noah's account raises the stakes. Genesis describes an unprecedented divine judgment and a mandate to build an ark in a world that had never seen such a thing. Hebrews 11:7 highlights a particular pattern. By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear, constructed an ark for the saving of his household. Noah's faith is both communal and costly. He labored publicly on a project that looked absurd to neighbors. He faced ridicule and the long grind of preparation. The text invites us to imagine the daily toil, the social isolation, the accusations. Yet Noah obeyed a warning and trusted God's promise. Application vignette. Think of someone named Aisha who feels called to reconcile a broken relationship in her family. An act that might humiliate her or expose her to gossip. The parallel is not mechanistic. Building an ark does not guarantee that ears will stop mocking you, but Noah shows that obedience to what God reveals, even when unseen by others, mobilizes God's saving work in surprising ways. Reflection prompt. What ark-building task is God asking you to begin, one that looks foolish to onlookers? List the first 3 practical steps you could take this week. Abraham and Sarah, risking everything for a promise. Genesis 12:15-17-21, Hebrews 11:8-12, 17-19. At the center of Hebrews 11 sits Abraham, called, moved, promised, tested. The arc of Abraham and Sarah's story is dense with themes Hebrews wants to highlight. Hospitality to the unknown, faith that trusts promises beyond possibility, and willingness to obey even when asked to surrender the promised son. Hebrews 11:8 summarizes his early obedience. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. That call uprooted him from familiar structures into a nomadic trust. Hebrews 11:11 praises Sarah's faith as well. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age. This is striking because it reframes barrenness, social shame, and the longing for legacy in terms of faith's patience and God's timing. Then comes perhaps the most shocking test. Hebrews 11:17-19 recounts Abraham's willingness to offer Isaac, interpreted by the writer as an act of faith, because Abraham trusted God's promise of descendants even when it seemed extinguished by sacrifice. The narrative in Genesis 22 is terrifying in its demand, and the theological point is raw. Faith sometimes involves surrendering the very thing you were promised, trusting that God's promise will not fail, even when the present points otherwise. Application Vignette 1. A single parent named Marcus invests himself in a ministry opportunity that requires relocating and uncertain finances. It would be safer, by human calculation, to stay. Abraham's story reframes the choice. Faith often requires risk, not reckless adventure, but obedience to a call bigger than our comfort. Marcus discerns steps, prayerful counsel, a modest savings plan, and a timeline for decision. Faith that is practiced in small, prudent steps, even when it carries risk. Application Vignette 2. Consider Esther, who has longed for a child and heard medical prognosis that seems final. Sarah's story does not promise a guaranteed miracle in every case, nor does it suggest that faith bypasses medical realities. Instead, it compels endurance in hope and openness to God's surprising sovereignty. For Esther, this might look like combining wise medical advice with a posture of trust, engaging community support, exploring adoption or foster care as acts of faith, and accepting that faith sometimes means living confidently in God's promises, even when the outcome is unclear. Exegetical aside, when Hebrews says Abraham accounted God as able to raise Isaac from the dead, Hebrews 11:19 is interpretive and has been read in multiple ways. It is reasonable to mark that as an interpretive theological reading rather than an explicit detail in Genesis. The author reads the event typologically, seeing in Abraham's willingness a trust so complete that death itself could not frustrate God's promise. That is a theological claim by the Hebrews author, not a historical addition to Genesis. Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Faith as legacy and forward vision. Hebrews 11:20-22, Genesis 26:28, 37-50. The next cluster, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, illustrates how faith is transgenerational. Promises are passed, received, and acted upon across family lines. Hebrews 11:20 notes, by faith Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. Isaac's actions are small but decisive, blessing the future, aligning his household with promise rather than present preference. Jacob's story, full of struggle and transformation, testifies to faith that persists despite deceit, exile, and reconciliation. Hebrews 11:21 highlights Jacob's deathbed faith, his act of blessing his sons, calling them forward into destiny. Then Joseph. Hebrews 11:22 compresses a long, dramatic life into a line. By faith Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. That detail is heavy with forward-looking faith. Despite betrayal, slavery, false accusation, and prison, Joseph preserved a vision for the future, a belief that God would bring redemption that he himself might not fully see. Application Vignette. For families today, these stories are practical. A father or mother who chooses to bless a child into vocational uncertainty, or who names a value, "We will pursue justice in this home," is echoing Isaac's and Jacob's actions. When parents practice faith that speaks of future hope, giving children a legacy of perspective rather than anxiety, it constitutes a visible way faith embeds itself into generations. Modern illustrative composite. Think of a grandfather, Luis, who endured exile and poverty. Instead of teaching fear, he tells the grandchildren stories of endurance and keeps a simple heirloom, a worn Bible, placed where grandchildren can see it. He prays aloud for their futures and models hospitality. He cannot ensure their destiny, but he communicates a forward-looking trust that shapes their imaginations toward perseverance. Joseph's particular contribution is instructive for those who feel wronged or sidelined. His faith did not protect him from injustice. It preserved a trust that God's purposes were larger than his immediate suffering. For anyone in a season of betrayal, Joseph's life offers a roadmap. Maintain integrity, cultivate patience, and keep an eye on the broader narrative God may be writing. Reflection prompt. Who in your family has modeled faith for you, intentionally or by quiet endurance? How might you pass that legacy to the next generation this year? Joseph is also a reminder that faith often looks ordinary for long stretches. He labored as a servant, administered as a steward, and slogged through prison before rising to influence. This is crucial for modern expectations. Hebrews 11 is shockingly patient with unglamorous devotion. It does not glamorize overnight success. It honors faithfulness in small places. Mini ganchos. If this next hero flips what you think about leadership in God's economy, pay attention. The movement from Joseph to Moses is a hinge in the biblical story, a shift from family survival to national identity. And the way faith appears in that shift will force us to ask tough questions about courage and identity. The lives we've examined so far establish a rhythm. Faith appears as initial trust, Abel; daily intimacy, Enoch; obedient preparation against ridicule, Noah; risky covenantal trust, Abraham and Sarah; the passing on of hope, Isaac, Jacob; and faithful endurance through betrayal, Joseph. Each vignette is not a self-help anecdote. It is a portrait of lives reoriented toward God's promise, a series of acts that together form the anatomy of biblical faith. Before we turn to the dramatic story of Moses and the Exodus, pause for a moment. Notice the recurring costs: social scorn, personal risk, long seasons without visible fruit, and even calls to surrender beloved promises. Hebrews 11 refuses to sanitize these realities. In fact, the author leans into them in the later verses of the chapter, insisting that many of the faithful did not receive the things promised in their lifetimes. Hebrews 11:39. The shock of Hebrews 11 is not that faith guarantees immediate comfort. It is that faith remains the way God reshapes history despite, or sometimes through, our suffering. Short reflective exercise. Close your eyes and name one situation where you feel stuck, where hope seems distant. Write down a single act you could do this week that would be a concrete expression of trust, e.g., initiate a difficult conversation, give a modest gift, volunteer, fast from a distraction. Begin a daily habit of reading scripture for 5 minutes. This is not a magic spell. It is a practice that aligns heart and will with God's promises. As we move toward Moses, keep this question with you. How does faith shape identity? Joseph's faith preserved a hope for a nation. Moses' story will force believers to choose identity over comfort, calling over cultural safety. The stakes rise. The next chapter of Hebrews' roll call will take us into parental courage, self-denial, and an exodus that redefines what it means to belong to God. Moses, identity chosen over comfort, Exodus 1-15, Hebrews 11:23-29. Moses' story is the pivot from family faith to national deliverance. Hebrews names him not for his miracles alone, but for a series of decisions that reveal what faith does to identity. Consider the scene. A Hebrew mother hides a child in the bulrushes, Exodus 2:1-10, a set of choices under pressure that preserve a future. Hebrews 11:23 credits Moses' parents with faith, acting despite fear, choosing life for their son rather than surrendering to terror. Later, Moses himself refuses to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Hebrews 11:24-26 says he chose rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He counted the reproach of Christ greater wealth than Egypt's treasures. The shock here is that faith changes your affiliation. Moses renounced comfort to claim identity. He preferred the risk of belonging to God's people over the security of palace life. The Red Sea crossing, Hebrews 11:29, makes clear that obedience to God's direction, not merely boldness, is the mechanism of deliverance. It was by faith that the people passed through the sea as through dry land, their faith enacted by following God's command through a seemingly impossible route. Context note: Hebrews highlights Moses' choices as examples of faith's moral cost, rejecting easy gain, enduring shame, and leading a people through unknown trials. When the author says Moses refused, this is interpretive shorthand for his choices narrated in Exodus. It illustrates the theme: faith shapes identity and commands costly loyalty. Application vignette. Imagine Rachel, a young professional offered a promotion that would require compromising her conscience, silencing ethical concerns at work for quicker advancement. She knows refusal will slow her career. Moses' posture reframes the question: which identity are you investing in? Temporary prestige or lasting fidelity? Rachel decides to take a lower-profile role where she can keep her integrity, sets up monthly accountability with a mentor, and joins a small group to cultivate courage for difficult conversations. Reflection prompt: what palaces in your life are tempting you with security at the expense of allegiance? Name one concrete choice you can make this week that aligns your identity with Christ, however costly. Rahab, faith that crosses barriers, Joshua 2, Hebrews 11:31. Rahab's brief story in Joshua and her inclusion in Hebrews 11 might surprise us, but that is the shock Hebrews intends. A Canaanite woman in Jericho, Rahab chooses to protect Israelite spies and allies herself with the God of Israel. Hebrews 11:31 records, "By faith Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies." Hebrews uses her to underline 2 points. Faith is not limited by background or social status, and faith often entails risk and subversion. Rahab's welcome was treasonous in her context. It put her life and reputation on the line. Yet her action aligned her with God's purposes and brought rescue to her household. Joshua 6:22-25. Theological aside, Rahab is also listed in Matthew's genealogy, Matthew 1:5, demonstrating that faith can create surprising lineage and inclusion. This signals biblical openness to transformed lives and the way God repurposes social outcasts into heirs of promise. Application vignette. Consider a community organizer named Daniel who works in a neighborhood with deep social divides. A local family, historically opposed to the church, faces eviction. Daniel advocates for them publicly and connects them with resources, risking criticism from both sides. Like Rahab, his faith crosses social barriers, choosing compassion and risk over comfort and cultural safety. The result is not guaranteed applause. Sometimes it is suspicion, but it models faith that allies itself with God's work across lines. Reflection prompt: where can you extend welcome that risks reputation towards someone culturally different, socially marginalized, or morally stigmatized? Write down one actionable way to do this in the next 2 weeks. Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, imperfect instruments, costly faith, Judges 6:2-16, 11, Hebrews 11:32. Hebrews 11 moves into the era of the judges and includes a compressed list: Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. Hebrews 11:32, ESV. This roster is theologically provocative because many of these figures are flawed, ambiguous, and morally complex. The chapter's point is not to canonize flawless behavior, but to show that God used broken people who acted in faith. The shock is that faith does not require moral perfection to be effective. It requires trust and obedience. Gideon. In Judges 6-8, we meet a man who hides in a winepress to thresh wheat, an unlikely military leader. God calls Gideon to deliver Israel. Gideon's initial reluctance and demand for signs, Judges 6:36-40, reveal human hesitation. Yet he obeys when God directs, and through unlikely numbers he defeats the Midianites. Hebrews names him for his faith because he acted in trust despite fear and doubt. Barak and Deborah, Judges 4:5, present Deborah as a prophetess and judge who calls Barak to battle. Barak insists Deborah accompany him, revealing mixed faith, willingness to act but dependence on prophetic presence. Their victory, achieved through obedience to God's command, highlights faith as cooperation. Prophetic word met by human obedience. Samson. Judges 13-16 is a tragic tale of charisma and collapse. Samson's strength, connected to his Nazirite vow, is an instrument of God, yet his personal choices lead to downfall. Hebrews' inclusion shows that even a flawed figure can be used to deliver God's people when a posture of faith intermittently expresses itself. Jephthah. Judges 11 is one of the most difficult narratives. Jephthah vows a terrible vow to secure victory, and interpreters disagree on details concerning Jephthah's daughter. Hebrews' mention places him among those who acted in faith despite the gravity of their choices. When a text is morally troubling, Hebrews asks us to see the wider pattern rather than excuse poor vows. Faith can be earnest but misapplied. God's glory is not a justification for rash promises. Interpretive caution. When details are disputed, Jephthah's vow and its outcome, we must mark them as areas of interpretive complexity. Hebrews uses these stories to highlight faith's presence, not to endorse every decision made by the heroes. Application vignette. Sarah leads a small non-profit and faces a decision to partner with a larger organization that conflicts with some of her values. Like the judges, she must weigh counsel, prophetic insight, and prudence. She creates a decision matrix. List non-negotiables, consult trusted advisors, pray and wait 10 days, then act. This pragmatic pattern mirrors Gideon's and Barak's mix of divine prompting and human discernment. Reflection prompt. Where has your faith produced imperfect decisions? How can you bring those decisions under wiser counsel and repair if needed? David, Samuel, and the prophets. Courage, repentance, prophetic fidelity. 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, prophetic books. Hebrews 11:32-40. Hebrews 11 survey culminates in David, Samuel, and the prophets. David's famous faith moment, facing Goliath, 1 Samuel 17, is shorthand for courage rooted in memory of God's past faithfulness. David's life is not a clean moral ledger. He sins deeply and repents deeply. Hebrews' inclusion of David alongside Samuel and the prophets shows faith as both bold trust and repentant heart, a pattern that combines courage, moral reckoning, and enduring witness. Samuel represents faithful pastoral and prophetic ministry, a life of listening and speaking into Israel's shifting identity. 1 Samuel 3:7-12. The prophets referenced by Hebrews include Isaiah, Jeremiah, Elijah, and others who spoke God's word under threat, sometimes experiencing derision, imprisonment, or worse. Hebrews 11:32-38 briefly catalogues their sufferings. People were tortured, imprisoned, stoned, sawn in two, interpretive phrasing, destitute, afflicted, and wandering. The language is vivid because the author wants to confront the myth that faith is a painless path to success. Exegetical aside, The phrase in Hebrews 11:37 about being sawn in two is a traditional way later readers understood martyrdom. Tradition attributed the fate to Isaiah in some early accounts, but Hebrews itself is summarizing the severity of persecution rather than providing a catalogue of specific deaths. We should treat details like that as traditional echoes, not new biblical claims. Application vignette. Marcus, a pastor, faces community rejection for refusing to compromise on justice issues. He experiences loss. Donors withdraw. Social standing diminishes. His faith is tested. Like the prophets, he must balance prophetic confrontation with pastoral compassion, seek counsel, and practice disciplines that sustain him. Sabbath rest, theological friendships, and clarity of mission. Reflection prompt. Are you prepared to endure loss for the sake of faithful witness? Identify one spiritual practice that will sustain you in seasons of opposition, e.g., weekly Sabbath, monthly debrief with a spiritual mentor, a journal of gratitude. Mid-segment theological pause. What Hebrews 11 is teaching us about faith? Take a step back and look at the pattern. Hebrews 11 is not primarily an encouragement to perform spiritual gymnastics. It is a theological teaching that faith is relational trust that manifests as obedience, endurance, risk, and sometimes suffering. Several theological points emerge. 1. Faith is relational, not transactional. The author of Hebrews uses pistis to emphasize trust in God, assurance and conviction about the unseen. This faith is tethered to God's promises and character, not to a formula. 2. Faith is public and practical. Hebrews does not celebrate private piety alone. It highlights acts, offering, going out, building an ark, passing through a sea, conquering a city, visible expressions of trust. 3. Faith coexists with doubt and imperfection. The heroes are not paragons of flawless theology. They are messy people whose faith moves them into action. God often uses the willing more than the perfect. 4. Faith often costs and often waits. Hebrews 11:39 is explicit, and all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised. Their hope extended beyond their lifetimes. Faith is future-oriented, trusting God in the present, even when the promise is deferred. 5. Faith is oriented to God's purposes, not private gain. The consistent thread is that God's redemptive plan advances through faithful obedience. It's not a checklist for personal privilege. Exegetical microsegment. The Greek word hypostasis, Hebrews 11:1, carries the idea of substance or grounding. Faith provides the reality undergirding hope, a firm assurance. That isn't academic nuance. It describes the psychological and spiritual reality that makes people act differently. It converts future promise into present courage. Common misconceptions addressed. Now, the chapter asks us to correct 2 persistent misunderstandings. Misconception 1. Faith is a formula that guarantees outcomes. Hebrews 11 shows that faith is not a magic key to automatic blessing. Many faithful people in the chapter suffer and die without seeing the promise fulfilled in their lifetime. Hebrews 11:35-38. To claim otherwise is to misread the biblical pattern. Misconception 2. Faith is merely positive thinking. The Bible's faith is costly, embodied, and communal. It often involves obedience that conflicts with social safety, and it requires endurance when visible rewards are absent. Modern analogies. Consider someone in medical crisis. Faith doesn't bypass medicine. Rather, it partners with wisdom. A person's faith might lead them to seek the best care, to gather community support, to endure treatments with hope, and to live with the possibility of either healing or redemptive meaning in suffering. Faith provides meaning and orientation. It is not a substitute for action or sober realism. Application vignette. Lena is facing a prolonged illness. She organizes a treatment plan with doctors, but she also gathers a prayer and support team, assigns friends to practical tasks, and keeps a gratitude journal to sustain hope. Her faith informs choices and resilience. It does not insulate her from pain or legislate the outcome. Rahab to the prophets. What pattern emerges? As we group these heroes, a few patterns crystallize. Faith often begins with a call or promise. It is acted upon publicly. It entails sacrifice. It waits for future fulfillment, and it often involves suffering. Hebrews threads these themes to argue that faith is God's chosen instrument to accomplish redemption. Practical, mid-course adjustments, how to practice faith today. The rest of the chapter is intentionally pastoral. We now ask, how do we take these biblical patterns and make them practical in the 21st century? Here are concrete steps, measurable, repeatable, and faithful to the theology we've seen. Underst, define the arc God may be asking you to build. Every significant act of faith begins with a clear task. Write down one project that seems necessary but foolish to outsiders. Reconciling a relationship, launching a community ministry, leaving a harmful job. Break it into 3 immediate steps you can take this week. Measure progress by actions, not feelings. 2. Build a timeline with accountability. Faithful risk benefits from community oversight. Name 2 people who will check in monthly on your progress. Make these relationships reciprocal and practical. 3. Cultivate daily habits of companionship with God. Enoch's example is not an exceptional outlier. It models daily walking with God. Choose one daily habit. 10 minutes of scripture reading, journaling, or silence, and commit for 30 days. Track it in a simple habit app or paper log. 4. Practice legacy actions. Isaac and Jacob show faith as passing blessing. Consider one actionable habit to bless your family, an intentional conversation about values, a family prayer evening, a written letter of encouragement. 5. Prepare to suffer well. Hebrews does not sanitize suffering. Develop practices that sustain you in trials. Cultivate friendships that can bear sorrow. Learn to lament honestly in prayer without promising outcomes, and keep a spiritual director or trusted mentor to help navigate long seasons of grief. 6. Engage in risky compassion. Like Rahab, faith sometimes requires social risk. Choose one way to cross a communal barrier, serve in a neighborhood different from your own, adopt a posture of hospitality, or mentor someone on the margins. 7. Rehearse faith with small, faithful actions. Faith grows through repetition. Give small, sacrificial gifts. Show up consistently to community service. Volunteer in short-term projects. These habits build muscle memory for larger calls. Modern illustrative composite. The unlikely pastor. Illustrative. This composite story is a blend of real-life patterns to illustrate how Hebrews 11 translates today. A pastor named Daniel leaves a high-paying corporate role to serve a struggling church. He faces ridicule from peers and financial pressure at home. He adopts a 3-month austerity plan, asks former colleagues for part-time consulting work, and recruits a team of volunteers for a community meal program. Over 2 years, the church stabilizes, a food pantry starts, and young families begin to see the church as a place of refuge. Daniel's choice mirrors Moses' identity shift, Noah's obedient preparation, and Rahab's hospitable risk. This is not a promise of success. It is an example of faith aligning risk, persistence, and community. The climactic theological insight. Hebrews 11:39-40, and the cloud of witnesses, Hebrews 12:1-2. Having surveyed the heroes, Hebrews culminates in a theological punch. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect. Hebrews 11:39-40 ESV. The implication is startling. God's promises are woven through generations. The faithful of old labored toward a fuller redemption that comes in and through Christ and into a communal story. Their hope is our inheritance, and our faith continues their unfinished work. Hebrews 12 opens with an image that shifts the metaphor from gallery to racetrack. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus. Hebrews 12, 1-2. The cloud is not merely an audience, they are witnesses, eyes that testify that faith works, sometimes through suffering. Their testimony urges us to perseverance. Practical implications of the cloud. 1. We are accountable to the narrative arc of God's people. Our choices echo forward. Small acts of faith contribute to larger redemptive movements. 2. We are encouraged by a community that has paid cost. If they endured, we can endure. Their stories are not mere inspiration. They are corporate instruction. 3. We must lay aside every weight. Hebrews warns against distractions that slow the race, personal sin, petty disputes, entangling anxieties. The heroes did not let comfort become the measure. Neither should we. Application steps for running well. 1. Identify one weight, a recurring distraction or habit that drains you. Commit to a 40-day removal plan. Explicit steps and accountability. 2. Name one entanglement, a relationship or habit that keeps you from wholehearted service, and seek counsel on how to address it. 3. Choose one weekly practice to refocus on Christ as the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. A focused Bible study, spiritual retreat day once a quarter, or a monthly service project. Pastoral warning, running the race is not about self-sufficiency. Hebrews 12:2 points us to Jesus. Our endurance springs from his example and his sustaining grace. This is not a call to stoicism, but to reliance. Martyrs and suffering, honoring the cost soberly. Hebrews 11:35-38. Hebrews does not romanticize suffering. The passage includes harrowing images, women receiving back their dead by resurrection, others tortured, chained, destitute, wandering deserts and mountains. This catalogue forces readers to face that faith often includes suffering and that God's purposes sometimes work through apparent defeat. Pastoral sensitivity is essential here. When people face persecution, loss, or chronic suffering, offering simplistic, "if you just believe harder" responses is cruel. Hebrews offers a different posture: presence, shared lament, and long-term accompaniment. Faith provides meaning and orienting hope. It does not ensure painless outcomes. Practical practices for those in suffering. Community rhythms. Establish a small caregiving team that rotates practical tasks, meals, errands, emotional check-ins. 2. Spiritual care. Engage a counselor or spiritual director to process grief and theological doubt. 3. Memory practices. Keep a journal that records small providences and moments of grace to sustain hope over time. Modern testimonies. 2 illustrative vignettes. 1. The nurse and the night shift. Illustrative. A nurse named Alicia works nights in a hospital overwhelmed by chronic illness patients. She is exhausted, tempted to cynicism. Inspired by Hebrews 11, she begins a weekly practice. On Friday mornings, she writes a card to one patient telling them the truth about their dignity. It costs her time, sparks emotional exposure, but slowly creates deeper relationships. Her faith is not rewarded with guaranteed outcomes. She still faces death, but her presence becomes a channel of mercy, and colleagues notice a shift in the ward's culture. 2. The entrepreneur who chose integrity. Illustrative. A small business owner, Tom, refuses to bribe officials to get permits. He loses contracts and faces bankruptcy risk. He chooses a plan of debt counseling, transparent accounting, and pivoting to ethical clients. Over time, a steady base of customers who value integrity emerges. The financial turnaround is not immediate, but Tom's story models the long arc of faithfulness. Final synthesis. Hebrews 11 as a blueprint for modern impossibilities. Returning to our opening thesis, Hebrews 11 is the blueprint for how ordinary people access extraordinary purposes. The shock is twofold. First, it refutes the easy equation of faith with fortune. Second, it reveals a pattern. Faith is relational trust that moves people to obedient action despite risk, thereby participating in God's unfolding redemptive plan. Put another way, Hebrews 11 teaches that miracles and deliverances are not primarily results of spiritual techniques, but the fruit of a posture that aligns our choices, identity, and endurance with God. That posture can be cultivated, practiced, and embedded in communities so that when the moment of call arrives, people can respond in ways that cooperate with God's action. Practical, measurable next steps to embody Hebrews 11 in the next 6 months. 1. Carpentry of the Ark. Identify one long-term, risky project. Write a proposal, set a timeline with milestones, and recruit 2 accountability partners. Review monthly. 2. Daily walking. Commit to a 5-minute daily habit, scripture, silence, or journaling for 90 days. Track progress in a journal or app. 3. Legacy action. Choose one intentional legacy act for your family, record a life story interview, write a letter to a child, initiate a family blessing evening, schedule it in the calendar within 3 months. 4. Risking hospitality. Host one person who is different from you for a meal once a month for 6 months. Use the meal to listen, serve, and understand. 5. Persecution. Preparation. If you face opposition for faithfulness, assemble a support team, 1 spiritual mentor, 1 legal financial advisor if needed, and 1 close friend to help with practical needs. Create a plan for 6 months to sustain you. 6. Small suffering plan. If you are in prolonged hardship, identify 2 practices to sustain you: weekly lament journal entries and a quarterly spiritual retreat day. Make appointments. Closing exhortation. Run with endurance. Hebrews 11 concludes not with triumphant finish lines, but with an invitation. We are part of an ongoing movement of faith. The cloud of witnesses urges us on. They did not receive the final promise in their lifetimes, yet their testimony is that faith is the instrument God uses to advance redemption. We are called to pick up that baton. Be realistic. Faith will not remove all hardship. Be faithful anyway. Be generous. Faith often expresses itself in service that yields no immediate return. Be courageous. Sometimes faith means choosing identity over comfort, obedience over applause. Final pastoral charge. If you are in a season of doubt, remember these patterns. Start with 1 small act of trust this week. Build it into habit. Invite others in. Faith is practiced in the ordinary slopes of life, not only in mountaintop moments. If this message has spoken to you, share it with someone facing an impossible situation. Let the cloud of witnesses encourage another heart. Live with the urgency Hebrews intends. Faith is not a relic to admire from a distance, but a living blueprint to be enacted here and now. Go, act in faith, and run with endurance the race set before you, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Amen.